Welcome, dear listeners, to another journey into the strange, stubborn, and surprisingly funny corners of history. Tonight, we're going to talk about money. Not just any money, but paper money, specifically the infamous Civil War greenbacks. Those crisp, inky notes that were once dismissed as worthless scraps, and yet, somehow, managed to hold together a nation at war. Now, you might be thinking, paper money? Really? That sounds about as exciting as balancing a checkbook. But bear with me, because this story is not about dull accounting. It's about survival, chaos, and the strange alchemy by which ink on paper becomes bread on the table, bullets in a rifle, and eventually, trust in a government. It's about how a piece of printed paper, something that looks like a slightly fancier grocery receipt, became one of the most important weapons of the Civil War. Picture the United States in 1861. The country is ripping itself apart. The Union is scrambling to pay soldiers, buy muskets, and ship food to the front. Gold and silver, the real money of the day, are disappearing fast, either hoarded under mattresses or sent abroad to pay for imports. The government is broke. The war is bleeding the treasury dry, and creditors aren't exactly enthusiastic about lending to a country that might not even exist in 6 months. Out of that desperation comes a radical experiment: print money. Not gold-backed notes, not redeemable promises, but flat-out paper. Declared legal tender because the government said so. Thus, the greenback was born. At first, people didn't know what to make of it. Was it real? Would shopkeepers accept it? Could you pay your debts with it? One farmer grumbled that he'd rather be paid in potatoes than in Lincoln's shin plasters. But there it was. A little piece of paper, stamped with patriotic imagery, carrying the weight of the Union cause. Soldiers were handed it as wages, and merchants began to grudgingly accept it. It was flimsy, controversial, and yet it worked. Of course, working came at a cost. As the presses kept rolling, prices rose. Suddenly, coffee doubled, bread tripled, and coal was a luxury. Ordinary Americans discovered that greenbacks didn't stretch as far as they used to. Inflation was no abstract concept. It was the empty pantry, the unpaid rent, the weary wife writing letters to her soldier husband, explaining that the money he sent home barely covered soap and flour. Meanwhile, speculators on Wall Street turned greenbacks into toys for profit. The gold room in New York became a frenzy of gambling, where fortunes were made or lost by betting on the paper's value against gold. While young men bled on the battlefield, the wolves of finance feasted on paper back in Manhattan. The irony was not lost on anyone. Yet despite the chaos, the greenback carried the Union through. Without it, the North might not have won the war. Without it, factories couldn't have churned out weapons, and railroads couldn't have carried food to soldiers. In many ways, the greenback was as vital as the rifle. And when the war ended, the debate over this paper money didn't end, it only grew louder. Should the nation cling to its experiment, or return to the hard money of gold and silver? Farmers, workers, bankers, and politicians all had opinions, and none of them were quiet. What's more, the legacy of the greenback stretched far beyond the 1860s. Later generations would remember it when they fought their own battles over inflation, debt, and the role of government in the economy. Populists of the 1890s invoked it as the people's money. Economists debated it as a turning point in financial history. And in the 20th century, when America finally abandoned gold altogether, many remarked that the true birth of modern fiat currency had happened not in the 1970s, but in the smoke and fire of the Civil War. So tonight, as you lie back and listen, we'll wander through this curious tale. We'll see how the greenback was born in crisis, how it shaped daily life, how it turned Wall Street into a casino, how it fueled bitter political fights, and how it left behind a legacy that still shapes the dollars in your wallet. It is a story, of desperation and ingenuity, of inflation and speculation, of trust and betrayal. But above all, it is a story about faith, not the kind sung in church pews, but the quiet faith that a nation can build itself on a promise printed in green ink. So take a breath, settle in, and let's unfold the tale of the greenback, the paper money that was never supposed to work, but somehow, against all odds, did. And if you enjoy stories like these, where the past feels strangely familiar, and history's ironies echo into the present, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. After all, history may not put coins in your pocket, but it just might buy you a good night's sleep. The year was 1861, and the United States was unraveling at the seams. The cannons had already spoken at Fort Sumter, and suddenly, what had been tense political arguments in Congress turned into war. The Union faced not only the daunting task of defeating the Confederacy, but also an equally pressing problem: how to pay for it. War is expensive. Every musket, every uniform, every ration of beans and coffee for the troops had to be purchased. And the federal government quickly discovered it was alarmingly short of funds. Until that moment, the United States operated on what people liked to call hard money. Coins made of gold or silver clinked reassuringly in pockets, while banknotes were only as good as the metal they promised to redeem. Creditors and merchants had faith in coin because it carried intrinsic value, or at least the illusion of it. But as the war escalated, gold and silver drained away like water through a sieve. Citizens hoarded coins, merchants demanded gold for imports, and what little precious metal remained seemed destined for foreign creditors. The treasury's coffers began to look more like bear cupboards than the vaults of a great nation. Abraham Lincoln, newly inaugurated and already burdened by the war, turned to his Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase. Chase was brilliant but cautious, and he knew the situation was dire. The government could borrow, of course, by selling bonds to bankers, but Wall Street was hardly eager to lend billions to a government whose capital was within marching distance of Confederate armies. They could raise taxes, but taxes were slow and unpopular in a democracy that had long prided itself on low tariffs and minimal federal intrusion. What remained was a desperate idea that had floated before but never been tried on such a scale: issue paper money backed by nothing but the authority of the United States. Thus came the Legal Tender Act of 1862. It authorized the government to print notes, what would become known as greenbacks, for the vivid green ink on their reverse that were declared legal tender for all debts, public and private. In plain terms, you had to accept them. They weren't promises to pay gold. Later, they were the payment itself. For the first time, Americans would hold in their hands a piece of paper that was money simply because Congress said so. When the first notes rolled off the presses, reactions ranged from skeptical to outright hostile. Shopkeepers grumbled. Some landlords refused to take them. Newspapers published biting cartoons, mocking the flimsy paper as shin plasters, good only for patching boots. Yet others welcomed them. Soldiers lined up at pay tables and received stacks of greenbacks better than nothing, certainly better than IOUs. Merchants, faced with customers holding this strange new currency, realized that turning them away meant turning away business. Slowly, grudgingly, the greenback began to circulate. For ordinary people, the experience was bewildering. Imagine being a farmer in Ohio, walking into town with a sack of potatoes to sell. A shopkeeper hands you, not silver coins as you expected, but these odd notes with intricate designs in a green tint. Do you trust them? Will the general store accept them for salt and sugar? The uncertainty was real. Letters from the time reveal confusion and sometimes humor. One wife wrote to her husband at the front that she had pinned greenbacks under her mattress, uncertain whether to treat them like money or kindling. Lincoln himself tried to reassure the nation. He argued that these notes were a patriotic necessity, a way for every citizen to contribute to the Union cause by accepting them in daily life. "The dollar is the nation's blood," one congressman declared, "and now we must trust it flows through paper veins." It was a gamble, but a gamble born of necessity. The gamble paid immediate dividends. Factories that might have shuttered their doors received greenbacks in payment for contracts and kept running. Railroads accepted them for transporting troops and supplies. Families of soldiers, though grumbling about rising prices, had something in hand rather than nothing. And most importantly, the Union Army marched on, fed and equipped by a government that had effectively conjured money from ink and paper. Yet the seeds of future trouble were already sown. By divorcing money from gold, the government had shifted the foundation of trust. Would citizens continue to believe in greenbacks if prices rose? Could paper alone sustain faith through years of war? No one knew. But for the moment, in the dark days of 1862, the greenback was a lifeline. It was fragile, controversial, and unprecedented, but it worked. The greenback was, in many ways, a leap of faith disguised as paper. To hold one in your hand was to hold an experiment, and experiments make people nervous. Merchants pinned them to shop walls with handwritten notes about what they would or would not accept. 2 greenbacks for a pound of butter scrawled. One grocer in New York, while another bluntly declared, "Gold preferred." A farmer who tried to use them at a livestock fair in Illinois wrote that buyers would take the notes only if forced, and with faces as long as the plow handles. Yet, the federal government pressed ahead, cranking out millions of dollars worth of notes. Each bill bore patriotic designs, portraits of statesmen, allegorical figures of liberty and justice, and, of course, the bold green reverse that gave them their nickname. To make counterfeiting difficult, engravers employed intricate patterns. It didn't work as intended. Within months, counterfeit greenbacks flooded the market, forcing the Treasury to dispatch inspectors and even create an early form of the Secret Service to track down forgers. Ironically, the effort to stabilize money helped birth America's modern system of financial policing. Ordinary Americans struggled to make sense of this new world. Newspapers filled with anxious letters. Will my debts be counted in greenbacks or gold? If I take them today, will they be worthless tomorrow? One Ohio schoolteacher described teaching children arithmetic problems in both greenback sums and gold sums, as though she were teaching to parallel currencies. And in a way, she was. The moment the greenbacks hit circulation, their value against gold began to fluctuate. Some days a greenback was worth 97 cents in gold, other days 90, and during the darkest stretches of the war, barely 35 cents. The notes carried not just ink, but anxiety. Lincoln and Salmon P. Chase tried to soothe the public. They assured citizens that these were not mere scraps of paper, but the lifeblood of the nation. Lincoln, ever the storyteller, compared them to soldiers, humble, sometimes battered, but carrying the cause of Union on their shoulders. As the men in blue march for the Republic, he said in one speech, so to these notes march in the pockets of her people. The rhetoric was stirring, but rhetoric alone could not calm inflation. Still, the greenbacks had one undeniable advantage. They spread quickly. From New England factories to Midwestern farms, people found themselves using them whether they liked it or not. Soldiers sent them home in letters. Banks grudgingly held them in reserves. State governments used them to pay teachers and clerks. Within a year, they had become an inescapable fact of life. And with them came subtle changes in how Americans thought about money itself. For centuries, money had been tied to precious metals, objects you could hold, weigh, and test with your teeth if you were skeptical. Now, money was faith. It was belief that when you handed a note across the counter, someone else would accept it in turn. It was the first step toward what economists today call fiat currency, money backed not by gold, but by confidence. In the 1860s, it was less a polished concept than a daily gamble. This gamble reshaped daily transactions. In Washington, D.C., boarding house keepers complained of guests trying to pay in greenbacks at one rate, while landlords demanded gold rents. In Boston, dock workers demanded higher wages to keep up with the shrinking value of paper. A Philadelphia diarist recorded seeing a butcher refuse greenbacks one day, only to accept them the next, when his wife reminded him that paper or no, people must eat. The oscillation between rejection and acceptance created a surreal economy, where money was simultaneously suspect and indispensable. Critics, particularly bankers, denounced the experiment as reckless. A nation cannot conjure wealth from paper, one pamphlet thundered, any more than a farmer can reap wheat from weeds. But defenders replied that survival trumped orthodoxy. As one congressman retorted, better a living nation with bad money than a dead one with good. Such debates echoed through taverns, newspapers, and even church pulpits. Ministers argued over whether greenbacks violated biblical injunctions about just weights and measures. For some Americans, using them felt almost like a moral failing. For others, it was a patriotic duty. The contradictions piled up, but the presses kept rolling. By 1863, over $400 million in greenbacks had entered circulation. An astonishing sum in an economy whose total GDP was only a few billion. The notes were no longer curiosities. They were the bloodstream of the Union. Soldiers, workers, and shopkeepers handled them daily, wearing creases into their fragile paper and leaving smudges of sweat and dirt. One soldier wrote to his brother, "I send you these ragged fellows greenbacks, they call them. Treat them kindly, for they are the best soldiers in my regiment." The gamble had begun to take root. America was learning, awkwardly, painfully, that money need not be metal to matter. But beneath the tentative acceptance, a storm brewed one that would make prices soar, fortunes wobble, and ordinary families wonder if the nation had traded financial security for a mirage. The greenback had saved the Union from immediate collapse, but in saving it, had set the stage for years of inflation and controversy. By the spring of 1863, the greenback was no longer an experiment whispered about in back rooms. It was a daily reality that every American had to reckon with. Soldiers stuffed them into knapsacks, clerks counted them out at pay tables, and storekeepers, though still wary, no longer had the luxury of turning them away. The nation had, almost by accident, created a paper-based economy. Yet with acceptance came distortion. Prices no longer behaved as they once had. A loaf of bread that had cost 5 cents before the war now crept to 10, then 15, then 20. Coffee, that treasured stimulant of soldiers and civilians alike, became a luxury item. Letters from the front told of soldiers sending home greenbacks, only for their wives to write back in dismay that the money barely covered a sack of flour. Inflation was no longer a word economists bickered over. It was a lived, knowing reality. Merchants learned to adjust, marking goods with 2 prices, one in gold, another in greenbacks. Newspapers published daily gold quotations, reporting how much paper it took to buy $1 in coin. Readers followed these numbers with the same fervor that later generations would track baseball scores or stock tickers. When the price of gold rose, grocers raised their prices before lunch. The economy had turned into a seesaw, balanced precariously on public confidence in paper. Wall Street, ever opportunistic, smelled profit. Brokers gathered in what became known as the Gold Room, a cramped but frenzied space in New York where men shouted bids and offers, speculating on the shifting value of greenbacks. For them, war was not tragedy, but opportunity. If confidence dipped, gold soared, and fortunes could be made overnight. Ordinary citizens watched this with growing disgust. "Our sons die while these men gamble," one editorial complained, "and their game is nothing more than trading the nation's lifeblood for their own enrichment." The anger was justified, but the spectacle only grew louder. Meanwhile, the federal government leaned ever harder on the presses. Salmon P. Chase, despite his earlier caution, realized that the war effort demanded resources that no tax could collect quickly enough. Every musket, every uniform, every bullet seemed to whisper, "Print more." Congress authorized additional issues of greenbacks, swelling the total in circulation. What began as a lifeline risked becoming a flood. Still, many defended the policy. Advocates pointed to the undeniable fact: without greenbacks, the Union Army would have starved. One congressman thundered that critics were happy to let the Republic bleed so long as gold remains untouched. For ordinary Americans, acceptance was less ideological than practical. A shopkeeper in Pennsylvania shrugged to a reporter, saying, "I take them because my customers have them, and they take them because I have them. Who started it, I can't tell, but here we are." In that simple exchange lay the essence of fiat money. Collective faith, sustained by nothing but repetition. This collective faith, however, was fragile. Rumors spread like wildfire. If a bank in New York refused greenbacks, whispers carried across state lines that collapse was imminent. When counterfeit notes were discovered in circulation, panic spread until inspectors reassured the public. And every dip in value against gold invited headlines about the rotting paper currency. Confidence was like glass, seemingly solid, but prone to shatter. Even within Lincoln's cabinet, doubts persisted. Chase himself admitted privately that he worried about the endlessness of paper. What if the presses never stopped? What if inflation spiraled out of control? Yet he also recognized the cruel arithmetic of war. Better inflation than defeat. Lincoln, ever pragmatic, backed him. "We must save the Union first," the president said, "and sound money afterward." It was a statement of priorities, and it echoed the grim logic of wartime governance. Survival now, reckoning later. The public, for all its unease, began to adapt. Street vendors in New York scrawled prices in chalk and changed them hourly, depending on the gold market. Farmers in the Midwest, at first skeptical, warmed to greenbacks when they realized they could sell crops at inflated prices. Workers pressed employers for higher wages, often successfully, creating a rough equilibrium. Inflation hurt, but it was endurable, at least for now. There was even a strange, almost sentimental affection that began to form around the notes. Their green backsides became familiar, their engraved portraits reassuring in their repetitiveness. Children collected them, just as later generations would collect baseball cards. A soldier described folding one into a letter home as sending a piece of the Republic. Despite their fragility, the notes acquired symbolism beyond mere economics. They were in some odd way tokens of loyalty, and yet, for every person who found comfort in them, another muttered darkly about ruin. Preachers thundered from pulpits that a nation founded on paper would collapse like paper. Bankers sneered that the United States had joined the ranks of banana republics, though the phrase itself had not yet been coined. The tension between necessity and orthodoxy was constant, and it shaped every trip to the market. Every wage negotiation, every newspaper headline by the middle of the war. One truth was undeniable. The greenback had changed the American economy forever. Even if the nation returned to gold one day, the memory of paper would linger. People had learned, however reluctantly, that value was not inherent but agreed upon. It was a lesson that would echo long after the last shot was fired. By late 1863, the greenback was entrenched in American life. The nation that had once recoiled from paper notes now relied on them so completely that imagining daily trade without them was almost impossible. Soldiers were paid with them, government clerks balanced ledgers in them, and families budgeted meals around their uncertain value. Yet their growing presence only magnified the controversy. On the streets of New York, the gold room continued to dominate headlines. Here, the greenback was not patriotic necessity, but a plaything. Brokers shouted and gestured wildly, their fortunes rising and falling with each rumor of Union victories or Confederate advances. A Union win sent confidence in greenbacks soaring. A defeat on the battlefield made gold skyrocket overnight. Observers compared the room to a madhouse, with men gambling not just on markets, but on the fate of the Republic. A soldier on leave who wandered into the gallery above the exchange remarked bitterly, "They trade our blood for their gold." Ordinary citizens grew increasingly resentful of this financial theater. Newspapers accused speculators of profiting from the nation's pain. Sermons condemned the obsession with gold as unpatriotic, even sinful. But the truth was that Americans followed the gold quotations as eagerly as they followed casualty reports. They had to. The daily price of gold told them whether the bread they bought tomorrow would cost 50 cents or 75. The greenback had turned money into a battlefield all its own, with victories and defeats as tangible as those fought with rifles. Amid this storm, the government sought ways to stabilize the situation. Congress authorized the issuance of greenback bonds, encouraging citizens to invest their paper notes in long-term debt. Banks were pressured to hold reserves and back national loans. The National Banking Act of 1863 attempted to create a more uniform system of paper backed by federal authority, rather than scattered state banks. These reforms were important, but to the average farmer or factory worker, they felt distant. What mattered was whether wages kept up with prices, and too often they did not. For working-class families, inflation was a constant squeeze. Diarists, from the period tell of women who cut meat portions in half, who watered down milk to stretch it, who bartered hand-sewn clothes to neighbors in exchange for butter. "We live half on greenbacks and half on prayers," one Ohio woman wrote. Soldiers in the field, reading such letters, felt both pride and guilt. Pride that their families endured, guilt that their pay seemed powerless against rising costs. The greenback, intended as a symbol of unity, often became a reminder of sacrifice, piled upon sacrifice. Not everyone suffered equally. Those with access to gold-wealthy bankers, foreign merchants, or anyone who had hoarded coins before the war protected their fortunes. In fact, many grew richer, exploiting the fluctuations between gold and greenbacks. This widening divide deepened resentment. The greenback was meant to be the people's money, but more and more, it seemed to highlight inequality. Lincoln, sensitive to public perception, defended the policy with a mixture of honesty and pragmatism. In his addresses, he admitted the strain but argued that without greenbacks, the Union Army could not march, the government could not function, and the war could not be won. He framed them as an imperfect but necessary sacrifice, like the war itself. It was not lost on him that Americans often mistrusted what they most depended on. Salmon P. Chase, meanwhile, wrestled with his conscience. He had once championed hard money, and had privately opposed the very system he now administered. His correspondence reveals deep unease. He feared runaway inflation, feared the day when confidence snapped like a taut rope. Yet he could not deny that the presses were keeping the Republic afloat. Chase later sought the presidency, perhaps hoping to distance himself from the policy that bore his fingerprints. But history remembered him as the reluctant architect of paper money. The greenback also reshaped politics beyond Chase. In taverns and town halls, ordinary citizens debated monetary policy with an intensity that would baffle future generations. Farmers argued whether paper favored city bankers or gave rural folk a chance to thrive. Workers demanded higher pay, indexed to the shrinking value of notes. Even soldiers, usually more concerned with rations than rhetoric, voiced opinions in camp newspapers about whether their wages were being debased. For the first time in American history, money itself became a democratic conversation, loud and impossible to ignore. And woven through all of this was a subtle but profound shift. Americans were beginning to grasp that money was not metal, not even paper, but trust. They were not philosophers, yet in their daily struggles, they acted out the most radical lesson of economics, that value is what we agree it is. A grocer who once scoffed at greenbacks now accepted them readily, not because he loved the notes, but because he knew his supplier would too. Faith in paper grew not from government edicts, but from repetition, transaction by transaction, until disbelief seemed impractical. Still, doubts lingered. A Confederate soldier, writing home, mocked the Union for depending on paper that will rot before the ink dries. He predicted collapse, but history proved him wrong. The greenbacks, fragile as they were, endured. They bore the scorn of critics, the ink of counterfeiters, the fluctuations of market sand, yet somehow, they remained in circulation. By the close of 1863, the United States had crossed a threshold. The greenback was no longer an emergency stopgap. It was the foundation of wartime finance. The Union was fighting with bullets and bayonets, yes, but also with paper promises that bound the economy together. Whether these promises would hold after the smoke cleared was an open question, but for now, they sustained the fight as the war dragged into 1864. The greenback had become both a symbol of Union resilience and a constant reminder of its fragility. By then, more than $450 million worth of notes were in circulation, a staggering amount compared to the modest sums that had once passed through the Treasury. For many, the question was no longer whether the greenback could keep the war effort alive. It clearly could, but whether the nation would survive the consequences of leaning so heavily on it. Inflation was biting deeper. In cities, families lined up at markets only to find staples like sugar and flour priced beyond their reach. In rural towns, farmers who once grumbled about taking paper now enjoyed high returns on crops. But their profits evaporated as quickly as they came, eaten by rising costs of tools, clothing, and labor. One Iowa farmer captured the paradox in a letter: "I sell corn for twice the price, but boots cost thrice, and I am no richer than before." Yet despite these hardships, the greenback had achieved something extraordinary. It had democratized the burdens of war. Every household that accepted paper shared in the risk. Every merchant who raised prices adjusted to its instability. Every soldier who sent greenbacks home knew that his family's survival depended on their continued acceptance. In this way, the greenback bound the Union together, not only through shared sacrifice on the battlefield, but through shared sacrifice at the marketplace. Still, not all were convinced of its virtue. Critics warned of a reckoning. Bankers predicted financial collapse once the war ended, and the government attempted to redeem its paper. "We are building a tower of debt upon a foundation of sand," one editorial warned. Even ordinary citizens voiced their fears. A diary from Pennsylvania recorded the worry of a shopkeeper who muttered, "When this war ends, our notes will be worth no more than wallpaper." Such cynicism echoed across taverns and parlors, mingling with hope and fatigue. Lincoln, however, framed the issue differently. He insisted that the greenback was not merely a financial instrument, but a patriotic emblem. To accept one was to believe in the Republic, to declare faith that the Union would endure. In his view, the dollar was no less a weapon than the musket. His speeches struck a chord, though they did little to soften the pinch of inflation. On the ground, life adapted in peculiar ways. Wages were renegotiated constantly. Employers paid workers on Friday, only for those workers to find by Monday that prices had jumped again. Landlords recalculated rents in the middle of leases. Churches passed collection plates filled with paper, then fretted about how far it would stretch to support widows and orphans. Children played with torn or worn notes, folding them into makeshift kites, while their parents silently worried whether those same scraps would keep food on the table next month. Even soldiers, the intended beneficiaries of the policy, expressed mixed feelings. Some proudly sent greenbacks home, calling them Lincoln's soldiers. Others despaired that their families could not live on what the notes could buy. A Wisconsin soldier wrote bitterly, "We fight with bullets, they fight with paper, and both leave us poorer." It was a sentiment that captured the dual nature of the greenback, vital, yet vexing, lifeline and burden in equal measure. Despite the unease, something remarkable had occurred. The American people had accepted, however grudgingly, that money did not have to be gold or silver to matter. They had crossed into a modern world where trust and necessity could give value to paper. Economists of the future would call this the birth of fiat money. But to the men and women of the 1860s, it was simply survival. Each transaction was a small vote of confidence in the Union itself. By the end of 1864, the greenback was more than currency, it was identity. It represented the North's determination to persevere, its willingness to improvise, and its gamble on the future. The notes, fragile and smudged, bore the fingerprints of millions: soldiers, farmers, seamsters, bankers, and clerks. Together, they kept the economy alive while the nation fought for its life. The story of the greenback's birth was not one of neat resolutions, but of uneasy compromises. It was the tale of a government pushed beyond tradition, of citizens learning to trust in symbols, and of a war financed not only with blood and iron, but with paper. As 1865 loomed and the end of the war came into sight, Americans wondered what would become of this strange invention. Would the greenback vanish like smoke, or would it linger as a permanent feature of national life? The answer would shape the decades to come. But for now, in the darkest hours of the Civil War, the greenback had done its work. It had turned doubt into endurance, paper into power, and necessity into history. If the greenback was born on the battlefield, it was nurtured and tested at home. By the early 1860s, families across the Union found themselves living in an economy that seemed to change from one market day to the next. Inflation, that invisible thief, crept into kitchens, workshops, and farmhouses, reshaping how ordinary Americans lived. To understand the Civil War as a social event, one must listen not only to the roar of cannons, but also to the quiet grumbles in markets and the anxious calculations of housewives balancing their ledgers. Take, for example, the story of Mary Chestnut, the famed Confederate diarist, but a Pennsylvania widow raising 3 children while her eldest son served in the Union Army. Mary received a steady stream of greenbacks from her son's pay, faithfully tucked into envelopes and posted northward. At first, she was relieved. "Better paper than nothing," she wrote in her small notebook. But soon, relief soured into frustration. The greenbacks arrived, but butter doubled in price, flour tripled, and shoes for her youngest daughter cost more than the entire month's remittance. Each letter of love from her son became a reminder that money stretched thinner. With every passing week, Mary's plight was far from unique. Inflation became a defining feature of daily life. Statistics from the time suggest that the cost of living nearly doubled between 1861 and 1865. Wages rose but unevenly. Industrial workers in booming cities like Chicago and Philadelphia often managed to negotiate higher pay, sometimes with the help of strikes. Farmers selling grain to the government enjoyed windfalls, though these profits evaporated when they had to buy manufactured goods at inflated prices. But the poor, the washerwomen, day laborers, and small clerks found themselves hardest pressed. Diaries and letters capture the emotional toll. One Massachusetts mother noted that her children asked for sugar daily, and daily I must say no. Another woman wrote to her husband at the front, "The children wear their coats threadbare. The tailor demands twice what he did last year, and I cannot pay him." Inflation turned simple necessities into luxuries. Families bartered when they could eggs for candles, potatoes for fabric, but barter had limits. Paper money, for all its flaws, was unavoidable. The psychological strain of inflation was immense. People who once felt secure in modest savings saw their nest eggs shrink in real value. Imagine putting aside $50 in greenbacks in 1862, only to discover 2 years later that it bought barely half the groceries it once did. Trust in money itself wavered. Families clung to gold and silver coins if they had them, hiding them in jars, or sewing them into clothing, but few had enough to make a difference. For the majority, life was lived in paper, and paper kept shrinking. Markets became theaters of complaint. Shoppers haggled, cursed, and accused one another of profiteering. Merchants, for their part, argued that they were victims forced to raise prices because wholesalers demanded more. Tempers flared. In one Boston market, a fight broke out when a soldier's wife accused a butcher of bleeding the families of men who bleed for the Union. The insults stung, but the butcher merely shrugged. "Ma'am, I bleed too, and it costs dear." Such exchanges reveal how inflation was not merely an economic condition, but a moral drama. Eroding trust between neighbors. Inflation also reshaped gender roles. Women, often responsible for managing household budgets, became frontline combatants. In the battle against rising prices, they stretched meals with ingenuity, watering soups, substituting chicory for coffee, baking with less sugar. Cookbooks of the era reflect this adaptation, with war recipes offering substitutes for scarce or costly ingredients. Yet beneath the practicality lay exhaustion. Many women felt abandoned, left to fight an invisible war of pennies, while their husbands fought with rifles. "I envy the men their bullets," one wife confessed, "for I am killed daily by numbers." Still, Americans adapted. Some embraced humor as a survival tactic. Newspapers published satirical poems about the magical shrinking dollar, poking fun at the absurdity of paying $1 for an onion. Children played games with greenbacks, pretending to buy each other's toys at inflated prices, unaware they were parodying adult anxieties. Humor did not erase hardship, but it softened it. The government, aware of the growing discontent, tried to respond. Congress imposed price controls on certain goods, though enforcement was uneven. Officials encouraged thrift and patriotism, urging citizens to see inflation as a shared sacrifice for victory. Patriotic posters reminded people that every dollar counts for freedom, framing acceptance of greenbacks as a civic duty. Yet such appeals rang hollow for families who could not afford shoes for their children. What emerges from these stories is not just an economic lesson, but a human one. Inflation was not numbers on a chart, but the gnawing fear of mothers, the frustration of workers, the quarrels in marketplaces. It was the lived reality of a society financing war with paper promises. And as those promises piled higher, so too did the sacrifices of ordinary people. Inflation did not strike every region of the Union equally. In bustling cities like New York and Philadelphia, markets reflected the volatility of gold quotations almost instantly. A rumor on Wall Street in the morning could send bread prices up by noon. But in smaller towns, especially in the Midwest, changes arrive more slowly, carried by newspapers or word of mouth. A farmer in Iowa might still sell pork at a fair price weeks after his cousin in Chicago had doubled his asking rates. This lag created strange disparities and fueled resentment. Consider the diary of a Cincinnati shopkeeper, Samuel Trenton. In 1863, he noted that a barrel of flour cost him $7 in gold before the war. By the time he wrote the entry, it cost 24 in greenbacks, and customers accused him of cheating. "They say I robbed them," he wrote bitterly. "But I pay robbers too, the miller and the merchant, and so the chain goes." Samuel's lament was common. merchants found themselves caught between rising wholesale prices and angry customers who saw only the final bill. Workers felt the pinch acutely. In industrial centers, wages did rise, but rarely kept pace with costs. Strikes erupted in textile mills, iron foundries, and railroad yards. One of the largest occurred in 1864, when Philadelphia streetcar workers walked off the job demanding pay in gold rather than greenbacks. Their reasoning was simple. Greenbacks lost value each month, while gold retained purchasing power. Employers resisted, but the strike drew sympathy from the public, who saw in it their own struggles with shrinking money. The inflation crisis blurred the lines between patriotism and survival. Employers accused striking workers of betraying the union cause by disrupting production. Workers countered that starvation at home was no less a betrayal. Political cartoons lampooned both sides. One showed a factory owner stuffing gold into his pockets while waving a greenback at ragged workers. Another depicted strikers marching under a banner reading bread, not paper. The humor was biting, but it reflected genuine tension. For farmers, inflation offered both pain and opportunity. Those who could sell wheat, corn, and pork to government contractors made handsome profits. The Union Army devoured food, and the government was a reliable buyer. Yet these gains were offset when farmers turned to buy plows, nails, or cloth. A farmer in Illinois quipped, "I sell hogs for gold, but must buy shirts for diamonds." His point was that profits vanished when he re-entered the marketplace. The illusion of wealth left many bitter. Women, again, were often at the center of these struggles. They organized food riots in some cities, echoing the more famous bread riots of the Confederacy. In 1863, a group of working-class women in New York stormed a market, demanding flour at fair prices and accusing sellers of war profiteering. While not as widespread as in the South, these protests revealed the mounting frustration of those left to manage households. Newspapers alternately mocked and sympathized with them. But the message was clear. Patience was wearing thin. Even leisure bore the mark of inflation. Theaters raised ticket prices, prompting critics to claim that art had become inaccessible to the common man. Taverns diluted beer and whiskey to stretch supplies, and patrons grumbled. Children's toys, once affordable, became rare treats. A soldier home on furlough might find that the greenbacks he saved bought far less joy for his family than he had imagined. The war had reached into every corner of civilian life, even play. Religious leaders attempted to interpret the crisis. For their congregations, some preached that inflation was a divine test, a reminder that earthly riches were fleeting. Others condemned profiteers as sinners who preyed on their neighbor's suffering. Sermons rang with biblical references to unjust scales and false weights. Parishioners found comfort in these words, but many also left church pews, wondering how to pay Monday's bills. Faith eased burdens, but did not fill cupboards. Meanwhile, newspapers churned out editorials debating causes and cures. Radical voices called for stricter price controls and heavier taxes on the wealthy. Conservative editors demanded a return to gold, denouncing paper money as phantoms. Between these poles, ordinary citizens searched for practical guidance. Letters to editors asked simple questions. Should I keep my savings in greenbacks or goods? Is it better to pay debts now or wait? The uncertainty reflected a deeper anxiety. No one knew whether the economic ground beneath their feet would hold. Despite hardships, a sense of endurance persisted. Families grew gardens in backyards, supplementing their diets with vegetables. Communities pooled resources, creating informal lending networks. Soldiers' aid, societies collected donations in greenbacks, knowing their value was unstable, but believing the gesture mattered more. Inflation tested resilience, but it also revealed a stubborn capacity to adapt by mid-war. Inflation was no longer a temporary inconvenience, but a constant presence like the drumbeat of news from the front. Families measured time not just by battles won or lost, but by how much butter cost that week. The home front had become another battlefield, one fought not with rifles, but with receipts, by 1864. The strain of inflation was visible in nearly every corner of Union society. The greenback, once hailed as a patriotic tool of survival, had become a daily irritant that reshaped how people thought about money, fairness, and even government itself. If earlier years had been marked by grudging acceptance, now fatigue and cynicism crept into the public mood. Markets grew louder, more chaotic. Prices fluctuated, not just monthly, but sometimes daily. Shoppers carried newspapers under their arms, scanning gold quotations before stepping into a grocer's stall. "I may as well buy the paper as the onions," one man joked, "for both spoil by tomorrow." Humor aside, the volatility was exhausting. Families no longer trusted that a week's wages would last a week. Employers sometimes paid in the morning only for prices to leap by evening, leaving workers poorer before they reached home. This erosion of trust bred anger. Accusations of profiteering filled the air. Shylocks and bloodsuckers became common epithets for merchants and speculators. Some of these accusations were unfair. Many shopkeepers barely scraped by themselves, but perception mattered more than reality. Inflation had a way of blurring distinctions, making every transaction feel adversarial. What had once been the quiet ritual of buying bread now felt like a duel. Communities responded in different ways. In some towns, mutual aid societies sprang up, pooling greenbacks to purchase bulk goods at lower cost and distribute them among members. These efforts were imperfect, but reflected a communal instinct to survive together. In others, hostility boiled over. In 1864, newspapers reported small-scale flour riots in Midwestern towns, where crowds of women confronted merchants over rising prices. Though less dramatic than the Confederate bread riots, they revealed how deeply frustration simmered on the Union side. Workers pushed back to strikes multiplied, and not just in big cities. In smaller industrial towns, carpenters, bricklayers, and machinists banded together to demand higher wages. Their petitions often read like miniature manifestos, blending appeals to fairness with sharp critiques of government policy. One group of Pittsburgh ironworkers declared, "We give our toil as our brothers give their blood. Yet our reward is paper that shrinks like cloth in the rain." The poetry of their complaint underscored the bitterness. The inflation crisis also reshaped family dynamics. Women, already central to household economies, became de facto financial strategists. They learned to spot counterfeit notes, to track market fluctuations, and to haggle with a fierceness that startled even seasoned shopkeepers. A New Hampshire diary records a woman boasting that she beat the butcher at his own sums, shaving pennies from a purchase by quoting the day's gold rate back at him. Such moments were small victories, but they symbolized how war had thrust financial literacy onto women in unprecedented ways. Children, too, absorbed the lessons of inflation. They overheard their parents' worries, played store with inflated prices, and mocked the greenback in childish rhymes. One popular playground chant went, "$1 buys a candy stick, tomorrow not a lick." While meant in jest, such games hinted at how even the young were inducted into the culture of economic uncertainty. Amid the hardship, the government tried to reframe the narrative. Patriotic newspapers reminded readers that inflation was a weapon of war, better to endure rising prices than to endure defeat. They argued that every inflated loaf of bread was part of the price of freedom. For some, this message resonated. Families wrote letters to soldiers saying they bear the dear costs for the dearer cause. For others, the rhetoric rang hollow. Patriotism, after all, did not fill empty bellies. Religion provided another lens. Ministers spoke of inflation as both a test of character and a scourge against greed. Some interpreted it as divine punishment for national sins, including slavery, while others urged congregations to see their sacrifices as Christ-like endurance. Church collections, once filled with clinking coins, now overflowed with paper. Clergy themselves worried that these offerings would buy less wood for heating or bread for charity. The spiritual and the financial intertwined in uneasy ways, yet, beneath the frustration, there was a kind of grim resilience. People adjusted their expectations, downsized luxuries, and found new ways to cope. They walked instead of taking streetcars. They mended clothes until they were more patch than fabric. They planted victory gardens years before the term, became famous in another war. Inflation narrowed lives, but it did not extinguish them. What is striking, looking back, is how inflation altered not just the economy, but the culture of trust. Before the war, Americans had assumed that money was stable, that a dollar was a dollar. After years of greenback inflation, they learned otherwise. They discovered that value could vanish overnight, that governments could manipulate currency, and that survival required constant vigilance. These were sobering lessons, and they would echo long after the cannons fell silent. By the end of 1864, the home front was weary. The war had demanded not only blood and labor, but also the endurance of endless price hikes. And while victory seemed closer with each Union advance, families could not help but wonder, when the guns quieted, would the paper in their pockets still mean anything at all? By 1864, inflation had become more than an inconvenience. It was a national obsession. Newspapers published daily updates on gold prices alongside war reports. Shopkeepers scribbled numbers in chalk on their doors, changing them as quickly as rumors shifted. The very act of buying and selling had turned into a constant reminder that the ground beneath American families was unsteady. The anxiety reached into politics. Candidates for Congress found themselves peppered with questions not about military strategy, but about bread prices. What will you do for the poor man's dollar? Became a rallying cry at rallies. Politicians who once ignored monetary policy were forced to address it, often with vague promises to restore confidence or punish speculators. Ordinary voters, who may have had little interest in banking before the war, now spoke fluently of bonds, reserves, and depreciation. The crisis had turned citizens into reluctant economists. At home, the strain deepened. Families adapted with remarkable creativity. Housewives learned to replace expensive ingredients with cheaper ones. Molasses for sugar, chicory for coffee, cornmeal for wheat flour. Newspapers even ran inflation recipes, complete with tongue-in-cheek titles like Union Pudding or Victory Soup. Some recipes were practical, others almost comical, but all reflected the desperation of stretching a budget. A popular joke advised, "If you can't afford meat, serve more gravy, it's patriotic." The humor masked real pain. Malnutrition grew common in poorer districts. Children's growth was stunted. Illnesses spread more easily in families. Unable to afford decent food, doctors reported more cases of rickets, scurvy, and other diet-related conditions. The war might be fought miles away, but its effects showed in the hollow cheeks of city children and the weary eyes of their mothers. Inflation also sharpened class divisions. Wealthy families, with access to gold and real assets, shielded themselves from the worst effects. They dined on imported goods, maintained their homes, and sometimes even profited by speculating on currency. Meanwhile, the working poor lived on bread crusts and weak tea. Resentment boiled over in taverns and church halls, where fiery speakers denounced the rich man's war, the poor man's hunger. The slogan captured the bitter sense that those who sacrificed most on the battlefield and at home were rewarded the least. The urban poor often bore the heaviest burdens. In New York and Boston, tenement families spent nearly all their income on food, leaving nothing for medicine, clothing, or education. Charitable organizations stepped in, but their coffers were strained by the very inflation they sought to combat. Donations in greenbacks bought fewer supplies, and demand always outpaced aid. The gap between promise and reality widened, eroding trust not only in markets, but in institutions meant to provide relief. Despite the hardships, many citizens framed their endurance as part of the larger war effort. Letters from the home front often reassured soldiers that their families bore the burden willingly. "We eat less, that you may fight more," one mother wrote to her son in the Army of the Potomac. Whether entirely sincere or partially bravado, such statements reveal how inflation became folded into the language of sacrifice. Paper money and high prices were not just inconveniences, they were symbols of commitment to Union victory. Meanwhile, counterfeiting compounded the misery. Criminals preyed on the chaos, flooding the market with fake greenbacks. Families already anxious about value now had to scrutinize each bill for signs of fraud. Bankers distributed pamphlets illustrating how to spot a counterfeit, but most ordinary shoppers lacked the time or skill to examine every note. The humiliation of discovering that one's hard-earned pay was worthless paper added insult to injury. Religious leaders once again tried to provide meaning. Some described inflation as a crucible, purifying the nation through suffering. Others condemned greed as the true enemy, warning congregations that the devil speculates more than any man. Still others urged their flock to remain patient, insisting that justice economic, as well as moral, would come with Union victory. Faith could not make groceries cheaper, but it gave people a way to frame hardship as something more than senseless misfortune. Looking back, one sees how inflation reshaped the very rhythm of daily life. Families no longer planned for the future. They lived day to day, sometimes hour to hour. The security of savings accounts, wages, and stable prices, things so easy to take for granted, vanished in the whirlwind of war. And yet, in that very instability, Americans revealed a stubborn ability to endure, to adapt, and even to laugh at their plight. By late 1864, the war was turning in the Union's favor. But the question loomed: would victory restore stability, or would the greenback's legacy haunt peacetime? For the moment, inflation remained the constant companion of every meal, every wage, and every whispered prayer for better days. By the winter of 1864, the greenback had become as familiar in American homes as the Bible on the parlor table, but far less comforting. Inflation was no longer a passing nuisance. It was a way of life, shaping choices from the kitchen to the ballot box. It touched every family, every transaction, every letter home from the front. And it left behind stories that reveal how profoundly war alters not just nations, but the fabric of daily existence. One story comes from a soldier named William Parker, who sent home a bundle of greenbacks to his wife in Ohio. In his letter, he urged her to buy something fine for the children, for I may not return. His wife tried, but found that the bills barely bought a pair of shoes. She wrote back, "The children wear your love, if not new boots." The poignancy of her words captured the cruel arithmetic of inflation, devotion measured in paper, value lost before it reached home. For others, inflation inspired bitterness. A clerk in New York described in his journal how he worked 6 days to buy meat for one. The sense of futility gnawed at him. To labor diligently, only to watch wages dissolve in the market, felt like a betrayal of the very promise of the republic that hard work should secure stability. Inflation mocked that promise, and yet there was resilience. Communities created informal safety nets. Churches hosted supper tables where neighbors pooled food to share at lower cost. Women's associations organized clothing drives, stitching together garments from scraps when new fabric was unaffordable. Families traded skills as much as goods, A carpenter repaired a roof in exchange for potatoes. A seamstress mended coats for firewood. In these exchanges, the weakness of greenbacks was offset by the strength of human connection. The inflation crisis also forced Americans to rethink the meaning of money itself. Was a dollar simply a measure of silver or gold? Or could it be, as the government insisted, a token of collective faith? The debate played out not only in Congress, but in kitchens and taverns. Some citizens clung to the old certainty of hard money, insisting that only coin was real. Others, by necessity, if not conviction, accepted that paper could bind society together. What began as a financial expedient became a philosophical question. What truly gives value to money, or trust? This tension foreshadowed the struggles of the post-war era, but even during the conflict, it shaped behavior. Speculators hoarded gold, creating resentment. Ordinary people hoarded goods, flour, sugar, coffee, turning pantries into miniature banks. The instinct was the same, to preserve value in a world where paper fluttered like autumn leaves. Yet, hoarding also deepened shortages, driving prices higher still. Inflation fed on itself, an endless cycle. Humor remained a coping mechanism. One popular cartoon showed a farmer using greenbacks as wallpaper, remarking that it was the cheapest paper in the land. Another depicted a housewife cutting a greenback into strips to light her stove. The caption reading, "Kindles fast, burns quick, just like its value." These jokes stung, but they also reflected an unwillingness to surrender to despair. Americans laughed at their misfortune, and in laughter found endurance by the war's final months. Inflation had hardened into habit. People no longer asked if prices would rise. They asked how much. The uncertainty bred caution. Couples postponed marriages, fearing they could not afford households. Parents pulled children from school to work and supplement family income. Soldiers, receiving pay in greenbacks, often begged their families to use them quickly before they lost more value. Time itself seemed to accelerate, as money shrank faster than lives could adjust. And yet, when Union victory came into sight, many clung to hope that peace would restore stability. Families whispered of the day when a dollar might again mean a dollar. Merchants dreamed of reliable ledgers. Workers prayed that their wages would stretch beyond bare survival. Inflation had tested the nation, fraying bonds of trust but also forging resilience. It was a crucible in which Americans discovered both the fragility and the strength of their society. In the end, the home front endured. Children grew, families survived, and the Union held. The greenback had fueled the war, but it had also forced millions to navigate a world where value was uncertain, and every purchase was a gamble. Inflation did not break the North, it scarred it, reshaped it, and left lessons that would echo in every future debate over money and government as 1865 dawned. The Civil War neared its climax. On the battlefields, soldiers braced for final campaigns. At home, families braced for another season of high prices, hoping that victory would bring relief. They had endured hunger, frustration, and doubt, all bound together by fragile pieces of paper. And whether they cursed or cherished the greenback, no one could deny its power. It had not only financed a war, but redefined what it meant to live through one. If inflation gnawed at kitchen tables and marketplace stalls, its heartbeat could be heard most clearly on Wall Street. New York, already the financial capital of the Union, became the theater where the fate of the greenback played out each day. To the untrained eye, the bustling exchange might have seemed no different from before the war clerks shouting, brokers scribbling furiously, men in suits waving scraps of paper. But underneath the noise was a new game, speculating on the value of money itself. The gold room, a cramped but infamous chamber off Wall Street, was the epicenter of this drama. Here, speculators bought and sold gold at lightning pace, wagering on the fortunes of the Union Army as much as on the dollar. When Union troops won victories, greenbacks strengthened and gold fell. When the army suffered setbacks, greenbacks sagged and gold soared. It was a cruel irony. National tragedy became private opportunity. For speculators, every headline was a chance to profit. Ordinary citizens watched this spectacle with a mix of fascination and disgust. Newspapers published the daily gold price alongside war dispatches, so that families in Ohio or Pennsylvania could measure victory not only in captured towns, but in cents on the dollar. A housewife might mutter, "Grant must have lost." A battle the butcher raised his prices again. In this way, Wall Street's games filtered into daily life, turning battlefield news into economic consequence almost instantly. The relationship between war and speculation was so obvious that one humorist quipped, "Lee fires his cannon in Virginia, and a pork dealer in New York sneezes." The joke captured the absurdity of a nation where the price of bacon depended on troop movements hundreds of miles away. Yet behind the humor was resentment. Many Americans believed speculators were vultures, feasting on the nation's pain. To them, Wall Street was not a place of enterprise but of betrayal. Speculators, for their part, defended themselves. They argued that by buying and selling gold, they provided a vital service, revealing the true value of greenbacks in real time. Without them, they claimed, citizens would be blind to the currency's worth. Some even cloaked their activity in patriotism, insisting that their trades gave the government crucial feedback. "We are the pulse of the Union," one broker boasted. "Ignore us, and you ignore the truth." Whether anyone believed him is another matter. The government, however, did not take kindly to these defenses. Officials viewed speculation as sabotage, undermining public confidence in the greenback. Congress debated laws to suppress gold trading altogether. In 1864, they passed a measure making it illegal to buy or sell gold futures. For a brief time, the gold room went silent, its doors locked by federal decree. But the silence lasted only days. Traders simply moved their deals into back rooms and hotel lobbies, out of sight, but hardly out of existence. Eventually, the ban was repealed, a tacit admission that speculation could not be legislated away. What angered the public most was not simply the existence of speculation, but its brazenness. Reporters described scenes of champagne-fueled revelry in brokerage houses, where fortunes were made and lost in hours. Meanwhile, soldiers marched barefoot and families skipped meals. The contrast was stark, and newspapers did not hesitate to highlight it. Editorials thundered that while the nation bled, Wall Street drank. Yet, it would be unfair to paint every financier with the same brush. Some bankers genuinely supported the Union cause, buying government bonds and encouraging clients to do the same. Jay Cooke, for example, became famous as the financier of the war by masterminding the sale of war bonds to ordinary citizens. His efforts contrasted sharply with the image of the greedy speculator, reminding Americans that finance could serve patriotism as well as profit. Still, the darker image of Wall Street dominated popular imagination. Ordinary people often fantasized about poetic justice for speculators. One cartoon depicted a bloated broker being chased by a mob of ragged housewives wielding rolling pins. Another showed greenbacks sprouting wings, flying from the pockets of workers into the coffers of Wall Street men. The satire was biting, but it gave voice to genuine anger. In an era when the line between survival and hunger was thin, speculation seemed not merely immoral but treasonous. At the same time, it is worth noting that speculation thrived precisely because the war made the future so uncertain. No one knew when it would end, or at what cost. In that uncertainty, gamblers found opportunity. For some, it was reckless greed. For others, it was survival, a way to hedge against the paper that shrank in value by the week. The gold room was, in many ways, a mirror of the nation itself. Chaotic, divided, and desperate to find footing on shifting ground. If the gold room was the beating heart of speculation, its pulse was set by news wires. The telegraph transformed Wall Street into a theater of instant reaction. Messages from the front lines, relayed within hours, could shift fortunes in minutes. A Union advance sent gold tumbling. A Confederate raid sent it soaring. Brokers stood like priests at an altar of information, scanning each scrap of telegram, paper, as though it were divine revelation. In a sense, it was. The fate of the Union translated into numbers on a CHALK BOARD. Telegraph boys became minor celebrities, racing through the streets with slips of paper clutched in their hands. Traders sometimes bribed them to deliver messages to one office before another. A rumor, true or not, could spark a frenzy. It was said that one false report of a Confederate victory in 1863 caused gold to leap 5% in a single day, only to collapse once the truth emerged. This volatility left ordinary Americans dizzy. If professionals could not keep their footing, what hope did a shopkeeper or factory worker have? For many, the spectacle confirmed their worst suspicions about finance. Wall Street seemed less like a marketplace and more like a gambling den. Critics drew parallels between brokers and card sharps, accusing them of betting on the nation's life. They trade not in wheat or iron, one editorial fumed, but in hope and despair. The language was moral as much as economic, framing speculation as a sin against the Republic. Still, the allure of quick profits drew men in droves. Some were seasoned financiers, others were grocers, clerks, or even ministers dabbling in speculation. Stories circulated of fortunes won overnight, stoking envy and ambition. Of course, for every lucky winner, there were countless losers. Newspapers told of men driven to bankruptcy, even suicide, after disastrous trades. In this way, speculation mirrored the war itself, gloried for some, ruin for many. The government wrestled with how to respond. Officials feared that unchecked speculation undermined confidence in greenbacks, making it harder to finance the war. In July 1864, Congress passed a law forbidding the trade of gold futures, hoping to choke off the frenzy. For a brief moment, victory seemed possible. The gold room closed, and newspapers declared the end of speculation, but the triumph was short-lived. Brokers simply relocated to hotels and private parlors, dealing in whispers instead of shouts. Within weeks, the law was repealed. The attempt to suppress speculation had only demonstrated its resilience. President Lincoln himself expressed frustration. In private letters, he condemned speculators as enemies within. "They aid the rebellion as surely as if they bore arms," he remarked. His words carried the weight of moral judgment, casting speculation not as mere greed, but as treachery. And yet, Lincoln was pragmatic. He knew that markets could not be wished away. Instead, his administration leaned on patriotic financiers like J. Cook to counterbalance the cynicism of Wall Street. Cook's genius lay in reframing finance as civic duty. Through relentless advertising campaigns, he persuaded ordinary citizens to buy government bonds. Posters depicted soldiers alongside slogans urging families to lend their savings to the Union. By purchasing bonds, citizens could feel they were directly supporting the war. This grassroots financial mobilization contrasted starkly with the cutthroat trading in the gold room. It offered a hopeful vision: money as a tool of unity rather than division. Still, the darker image prevailed in popular culture. Plays satirized Wall Street brokers as parasites. Political cartoons showed bloated men squeezing coins from starving families. One widely circulated cartoon depicted Lady Liberty chained in the gold room, surrounded by speculators waving champagne glasses. The symbolism was clear. Wall Street was holding the nation hostage. For working people, the contrast between bond drives and speculation was stark. To them, buying bonds was sacrifice. Speculation was exploitation. The fact that both existed side by side created a sense of moral dissonance. Was money a means of helping the Union, or of profiting from its pain? The answer depended on where one stood, in a farmhouse kitchen, or on the floor of the gold room. By late 1864, speculation had become inseparable from the broader narrative of the war. Just as generals maneuvered armies, brokers maneuvered numbers. Both battles shaped the fate of the Union. For many Americans, this realization was unsettling. The Civil War was fought not only with muskets and cannons, but also with ledgers and telegrams. And on Wall Street, victory and defeat were measured not in casualties, but in cents per dollar. By the peak of the war, Wall Street speculation had taken on a rhythm as predictable as the tides, yet as volatile as a storm. Every Union victory sent gold downward, and every setback pushed it higher. Traders lived on this pendulum swing, thriving on chaos, while ordinary Americans grew weary of it. For the public, the gold room became a symbol of a strange, unsettling truth. The nation's financial fate seemed less tied to hard work than to rumor and luck. Consider July 1863, when news of the Union victory at Gettysburg filtered into New York. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and in the gold room, the price of gold fell sharply. Patriotic editorials proclaimed that the greenback had been vindicated. Yet only days later, riots broke out in the city over the draft, shaking confidence anew. Gold prices surged back upward, erasing the Gettysburg dividend almost overnight. The episode demonstrated how fragile the market's faith truly was. Victory on the battlefield could not outpace fear in the streets. For many Americans, this volatility felt like betrayal. Soldiers risked their lives for the Union cause, only to see financiers gamble on the value of their pay. A greenback in a soldier's pocket might buy a meal one week, but not the next. Letters from the front often expressed bitterness. "We fight the rebels with musket, while our families fight them with prices," wrote one infantryman. The sense that Wall Street speculators were profiting from sacrifice cut deep at times. Resentment boiled over into violence. In August 1864, a mob of angry citizens gathered outside the gold room, hurling insults and stones. Police dispersed the crowd before serious damage occurred, but the incident revealed the depth of popular anger. Too many Wall Street was not only indifferent to suffering, but actively fueling it. Each spike in gold prices felt like a knife in the back of loyal families struggling to make ends meet. The government, caught between reliance on financiers and suspicion of them, tried various strategies to steady confidence. Officials released optimistic statements, sometimes shading the truth, to calm markets. Military victories were trumpeted with particular vigor, not just to boost morale, but to shore up the greenback. In this way, propaganda became financial policy. A victory in Virginia was worth more than captured ground. It was worth cents on the dollar in New York. But propaganda could only do so much. Wall Street men prided themselves on cynicism. "We trade in facts, not sentiment," one broker sneered when asked if he supported the Union cause. Yet even that statement was disingenuous. In practice, traders thrived on sentiment, on panic, on hope and despair. Facts mattered, but perception moved faster. And in the jittery world of 1860s finance, perception was everything. One curious feature of the time was the rise of amateur speculators. Clerks pooled savings to dabble in gold. Farmers sent sons to the city, not to fight, but to make a killing in finance. Newspapers carried stories of men who started with a few $100s and emerged with thousands, though just as many ended ruined. The democratization of speculation made the gold room seem both alluring and terrifying. A place where ordinary men might become wealthy or destitute in the span of a single telegram. Meanwhile, cultural attitudes hardened. sermons denounced speculation as sinful, likening it to gambling with the nation's soul. Political cartoons grew sharper, portraying brokers as bloated spiders spinning webs around the republic. Yet others admired the daring of speculators, seeing them as risk-takers in a time when risk defined the nation. This ambivalence reflected a broader truth. Americans have always been both fascinated and horrified by those who gamble with money. The Civil War heightened this contradiction. On the one hand, speculation seemed unpatriotic, even treasonous. On the other, it revealed the raw mechanics of capitalism in wartime. The gold room was not an aberration. It was the logical outcome of a society where markets ruled. If the war was a test of the Union's institutions, then Wall Street showed both their resilience and their moral limits. By the end of 1864, the gold room's reputation was sealed. For the public, it was a place where greed danced on the graves of soldiers. For speculators, it was simply business. And for the government, it was an unavoidable reality, condemned, but impossible to eradicate. The Union could not fight the war without Wall Street, yet it could never fully trust it either. That tension defined not only finance during the Civil War, but the relationship between democracy and capitalism in every era since by the early months of 1865. Wall Street was, in many ways, as central to the war effort as the armies marching through Georgia and Virginia. The financial world had become a battlefield of its own, where the combatants were not soldiers with rifles, but brokers with telegraphs, clerks with ledgers, and speculators armed with nerves of steel. The stakes, however, were just as real: the solvency of the Union and the ability to sustain the war effort. The gold room remained infamous, its reputation growing darker with each passing month. It was said that a man could hear more panic in that single chamber than on any battlefield. Brokers crammed shoulder to shoulder, voices hoarse from shouting, their eyes darting toward the chalkboard where prices shifted by the minute. Onlookers described the scene as a fevered madhouse, where fortunes evaporated as quickly as they appeared. To outsiders, the very idea of wagering on the nation's survival seemed grotesque. Yet to those inside, it was daily bread. The linkage between battle reports and market swings grew so obvious that satirists had a field day. One cartoon depicted General Grant and General Lee, not on horseback, but seated at a stock ticker, dueling with numbers instead of sabers. Another showed Confederate cannons firing shells marked gold, exploding in Union households as prices skyrocketed. The satire underscored a bitter truth. The financial war was inseparable from the military one. Ordinary citizens could not escape the consequences. Housewives in New England or shopkeepers in Illinois might never set foot in the gold room, but they lived with its echoes. A spike in gold meant higher flour prices, and that meant fewer loaves of bread on the family table. People came to resent the invisible strings that bound their kitchen budgets to the whims of Wall Street. In taverns, one heard muttered curses that the brokers in New York rob us quicker than the rebels in Virginia. Public anger sometimes reached dramatic heights. In February 1865, a crowd of laborers marched on a Wall Street brokerage, demanding that trading be halted until the war ended. Police dispersed them, but the message was clear. Speculation was viewed not merely as immoral, but as intolerable in a time of national sacrifice. Politicians took note. Some called for new legislation to suppress trading altogether, while others worried that such measures would only deepen panic. And panic was indeed the true enemy. Speculators thrived on uncertainty, but governments did not. The Treasury struggled to issue bonds at favorable rates when confidence in the greenback sagged. Salmon P. Chase's successors at the Treasury were forced to walk a tightrope, allowing markets enough freedom to function while preventing them from spiraling into chaos. It was a balancing act, made all the harder by the fact that the war's end remained uncertain. Even as Union victories mounted, The moral outrage over speculation did not spare the speculators themselves. Many lived in fear of being branded traitors. A handful attempted to burnish their reputations by donating to soldiers, charities, or funding hospitals, hoping to show that they, too, cared for the Union cause. Others simply retreated into cynicism, declaring openly that war is profit, nothing more. Such statements did little to endear them to the public. Yet, in fairness, it is worth acknowledging that speculation also revealed something deeper about American society. Its relentless faith in markets, even when they seemed destructive. The very existence of the gold room testified to a belief that value, however fragile, must be discovered through trade. Americans did not abandon markets in wartime. They leaned into them, however reluctantly, and that reliance both sustained and undermined the Union cause. By the spring of 1865, with Confederate collapse imminent, speculation reached a fever pitch. Traders wagered not only on the value of gold, but on the timing of peace itself. A premature rumor of Lee's surrender sent gold plunging, only for it to rebound when the news proved false. When the real surrender came in April, markets surged with relief, and greenbacks enjoyed a fleeting moment of vindication. The paper that had once been mocked as shinplasters had, against all odds, carried the Union to victory. But the moral scars remained. For millions of Americans, Wall Street's wartime role left a sour taste. The gold room had come to symbolize the uneasy marriage of democracy and capitalism, of patriotism and profit. It had shown that wars were not fought only on fields of mud and blood, but also in the ledger books of speculators. And the question lingered: would this lesson fade with peace, or would it haunt the nation long after the cannons fell silent? When peace finally arrived in April 1865, the cannons fell silent, but Wall Street did not. If anything, the frenzy intensified. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln that same month shocked the nation. And for a brief moment, financial markets trembled as though the very foundation of the Union had cracked. Gold prices spiked as traders braced for chaos. Yet within days, stability returned. This was perhaps the most telling lesson of all. Even in the face of tragedy, markets adjusted, adapted, and continued their relentless pursuit of profit. For many Americans, the end of the war brought reflection on the role speculation had played. Some condemned it outright, arguing that profiteering had prolonged suffering and eroded trust in government. Sermons thundered that greed has no flag, and pamphlets circulated denouncing brokers as little better than war profiteers who had fattened themselves on national blood. The gold room, though it remained, was indelibly stained in the public imagination. Others, however, offered a more pragmatic assessment. Speculation, they argued, was simply the natural byproduct of uncertainty. In a nation that had chosen to finance war through paper currency rather than rigid adherence to gold, volatility was inevitable. Speculators, distasteful though they might be, were merely messengers of that volatility. They revealed truths that governments preferred to conceal: that the greenback was unstable, that faith was fragile, and that war strained every institution, even money itself. The duality of this legacy cannot be overstated. On one hand, Wall Street embodied greed, selfishness, and the exploitation of crisis. On the other, it underscored the resilience of markets, their capacity to function even in the most uncertain times. This paradox is why the story of Civil War speculation resonates beyond its moment. It is not simply a tale of 1860s brokers shouting over gold prices. It is a mirror reflecting the uneasy relationship between capitalism and democracy in every age. For ordinary Americans, however, the memory was more personal. Housewives remembered the days when flour doubled in price overnight. Soldiers, widows remembered pensions paid in greenbacks that shrank before their eyes. Workers remembered paychecks that dissolved into thin air. For them, Wall Street was not a theoretical debate, but a lived experience of frustration, hunger, and resentment. The sense that financiers had prospered while families suffered became a scar that endured. Long after Appomattox, speculators themselves were not immune to the war's consequences. Many lost fortunes as rumors proved false, or as peace unraveled their bets. A handful rose to prominence, building empires on wartime gains. But for most, the gold room was a roller coaster that ended as suddenly as it began. When the war ended, speculation did not vanish, but it lost its wartime urgency. Gold no longer rose and fell on the fate of battles. It followed the slower rhythms of peacetime politics and commerce. Yet the habits formed during the war endured. Americans had become accustomed to checking gold prices in the newspapers, as though they were weather reports. Wall Street's centrality to national life had been cemented. The Civil War had not only tested the Union's armies, it had tested its financial systems. And Wall Street, for better or worse, had passed the test, though not without leaving behind deep moral unease. Perhaps the most striking legacy of the gold room was its symbolism. To critics, it remained a monument to greed, proof that capitalism could flourish even in the darkest times, feeding on fear and uncertainty. To defenders, it was evidence of resilience, a marketplace that revealed the truth, no matter how unpleasant. Either way, it became impossible to tell the story of the Civil War without acknowledging the role of speculators, who wagered not on cotton or corn, but on the Union itself. In the quiet that followed the war, newspapers published on speculation. Some condemned it as the nation's great shame. Others praised the return to stability and argued that the volatility of wartime finance had been a necessary evil. What united these perspectives was recognition that the Civil War had forever changed the relationship between Wall Street and the American public. The gold room had introduced ordinary citizens to the unsettling reality that their fates could hinge not only on generals and presidents, but on brokers with chalk and telegraphs. And so, as peace settled over the nation, the memory of wartime speculation lingered like smoke after a fire. It was a reminder that wars are not only fought with rifles and cannons, but also with ledgers and markets. The speculators of Wall Street had not worn uniforms, yet they had shaped the Union's fate all the same. Their legacy was ambiguous, their morality suspect, but their impact undeniable. When a young man in blue marched off to war in 1861, he carried more than a rifle and a knapsack. He carried a promised in or $13 a month, depending on his rank paid. In the paper notes that became known as greenbacks, it wasn't much, but it was meant to tether him to his family, a lifeline across the miles of mud, blood, and uncertainty. Those greenbacks became as symbolic as any musket. They were proof that the government recognized his service, and that his family might endure while he was away. But reality often betrayed the promise. A private's monthly wage, once respectable, was quickly eroded by inflation. By 1863, what $10 could buy at the start of the war might cost 15 or even 20. Soldiers rode home in despair, warning wives and mothers that their pay no longer covered the barest necessities. "I fight for the Union," one soldier wrote bitterly, "but my pay buys no shoes for my children." In this way, the greenback was both comfort and curse, a reminder of loyalty and a symbol of insufficiency. For families on the home front, the arrival of a pay envelope was an event marked with both relief and calculation. Mothers unfolded the crisp notes with trembling fingers, already knowing that the numbers did not stretch far enough. They became mathematicians of survival, tallying the cost of flour, candles, coal, and cloth. A child's new coat might be postponed. Meat might be stretched with beans. The greenback tied them to their soldier, but it also forced daily reckonings with scarcity. The problem was compounded by delays. Soldiers often went months without pay, as bureaucratic tangles or battlefield chaos disrupted payrolls. Families waited anxiously, sometimes pawning heirlooms or taking on debt to bridge the gap. Letters from wives to soldiers were filled with pleas. Send what you can, for the children hunger. The soldier, powerless to hasten the treasury, could only reply with apologies and anger. In camp, men grumbled that they served for promises, not pay. Yet, even in frustration, greenbacks held deep meaning. They were tokens of connection, reminders that though separated by war, soldier and family were bound together. Many wives tucked notes into boxes or sewed them into garments, treating them less as currency and more as relics of sacrifice. A $10 greenback, stained with the sweat of marching boots, was cherished not for what it could buy, but for what it represented: endurance, hope, and the tangible link between the battlefield and the hearth. The tension between value and meaning was never far from the surface. In some towns, shopkeepers offered discounts to families of soldiers, accepting greenbacks at face value as a gesture of patriotism. In others, merchants demanded higher prices, arguing that inflation left them no choice. These differences bred resentment. Soldiers' families compared notes, lamenting that loyalty to the Union was not equally shared. Some profit while we starve, a widow wrote, and yet they wave the flag as though they sacrifice. For African American soldiers and their families, the injustice was sharper still. Until 1864, black troops were paid less than white soldiers, their wages cut by discrimination, even as they risked the same dangers. When Congress finally equalized pay, many families had already endured years of hardship compounded by racism. For them, greenbacks carried not only the weight of inflation, but also the insult of inequality. Their struggle underscored how the nation's fight for freedom was marred by contradictions. In the barracks and around campfires, soldiers debated the worth of their pay. Some joked that greenbacks were good for poker, bad for pork. Others grew philosophical, asking whether paper could ever equal coin, or whether value was just a matter of belief. The war had turned farmers and mechanics into reluctant economists, forced to reckon with the mysteries of finance, even as they shouldered muskets. It was an education no one had asked for, but all received. The truth was plain: greenback wages were never enough. Families survived through ingenuity, sacrifice, and community support. Neighbors shared food, churches offered charity, and women took on extra work laundering, sewing, teaching to supplement meager incomes. Each dollar stretched was a testament not only to endurance, but to creativity. The story of soldier pay is not just a tale of insufficiency, but of resilience. And yet, as the war dragged on, frustration hardened. Soldiers began to feel that their service was undervalued, their families neglected. The greenback, once a symbol of hope, became instead a reminder of sacrifice without adequate reward. The irony was bitter. Men risked their lives for the Union, only to find their wages shrinking, faster than their years of service could replace. It was a burden borne quietly, but deeply, in hearts that longed for peace, not only for the nation, but for their households. While the value of a soldier's wages crumbled in the marketplace, the emotional weight of those greenbacks was profound. Letters sent home often included not only words of affection, but also carefully folded notes, wrapped in scraps of paper or tucked between pages. A father might write, "Dearest Sarah, enclosed you will find $15. Spend it wisely, and kiss the children for me." The money arrived, creased and sweat-stained, carrying the scent of campfires, gunpowder, and miles of marching. Families treated those notes almost as holy relics, both a lifeline and a reminder of separation. But sentiment could not shield families from the realities of inflation. Consider the plight of a Union widow in Indiana, left with 3 children, and dependent on the pension paid in greenbacks. At the war's outset, her stipend could cover rent, flour, and fuel. By 1864, the same amount barely bought flour and a sack of coal. She took in laundry to fill the gap, rising before dawn to scrub soldiers' uniforms sent home for cleaning. Every dollar stretched became a battle of its own, a battle. She fought in silence while generals fought in glory. Children, too, felt the strain of greenback wages. Diaries of the era tell of youngsters patching shoes with scraps of leather, or going barefoot through summers because boots were too dear. A boy in Pennsylvania scrawled in his schoolbook that he missed apples because mother says they cost too much now. The greenback was meant to connect soldier and child, but too often it became a reminder of what could not be bought. The disparities between regions added further bitterness. In urban centers like New York and Philadelphia, families could sometimes rely on charitable organizations or soldier aid societies to supplement wages. Rural families, however, had fewer safety nets. A farmer's wife in Ohio might face the cruel choice of selling off livestock or pawning heirlooms to feed her children. Stories circulated of women partying with wedding rings, family Bibles, or grandfather clocks to bridge the weeks before a pay envelope arrived. Each sacrifice carved another layer of resentment against both speculators and the distant government. And yet, there was pride too. Many families framed their hardship as part of their patriotic duty. Newspapers carried stories of wives declaring, "If my husband gives his blood, I will give my labor." Women organized sewing circles, not only to clothe soldiers, but to raise funds for struggling families. Churches held charity fairs where pies and quilts were sold, the proceeds distributed to households hardest hit by inflation. These acts of community solidarity softened the sting of greenback's shrinking value, transforming survival into a shared expression of loyalty. For African American soldiers and their families, the stakes were even higher. Enslaved men who escaped the Union lines and enlisted were promised wages that symbolized freedom itself, radical departure from bondage. Yet, when those wages were delivered late, reduced, or denied outright, the betrayal cut deeply. Black regiments petitioned Congress for equal pay, arguing that their blood was worth no less than white men's. Families of black soldiers bore the double burden of inflation and discrimination, forced to scrape by while knowing the nation still debated their worth. When equal pay was finally granted in 1864, the back pay provided relief, but did not erase years of hardship. In the camps, discussions of wages became as common as talk of rations or weather. Soldiers joked darkly about Confederate bullets and Yankee paper, mocking both the enemy's weapons and their own flimsy pay. Others grew philosophical. Could a piece of paper truly measure sacrifice? Was a life worth $13 a month? These questions revealed a simmering disillusionment. The greenback may have been a promise, but it could never match the cost of war. Still, in small ways, those wages shaped hope. A soldier's letter with a few dollars enclosed might brighten a household for weeks. A child might hold a greenback and boast, "Father sent this from the war." In those moments, paper became more than currency. It became proof of love, duty, and connection across the gulf of absence. The meaning of money, in wartime, was never only economic. It was emotional, symbolic, and deeply personal. By late 1864, however, the strain was undeniable. Inflation outpaced wages, debts mounted, and families began to question whether loyalty had been repaid with neglect. The government's greenbacks had kept armies in the field, but at the cost of hardship at home. Soldiers and families alike bore the brunt, their sacrifice measured not only in blood but in dollars that dwindled with every passing month. By 1864, the problem of soldier pay was no longer a private frustration but a public debate. Newspapers carried editorials blasting Congress for failing to adjust wages in step with inflation. Families wrote letters not only to their soldiers, but to politicians, demanding relief. One editorial in the Chicago Tribune asked bitterly, Shall the men who save the Union be left poorer than the speculators who mock it? The question captured a national mood, indignation at the gap between sacrifice and reward. In many households, women became both breadwinners and political voices. They petitioned state legislatures for relief funds, and in some cases, staged demonstrations when aid failed to arrive. In Massachusetts, groups of soldiers' wives marched to the State House, demanding food allowances to make up for rising prices. Their banners bore slogans like "Our husbands bleed," "Must our children starve?" These protests revealed a subtle but significant shift. The war was forcing women into public roles as advocates for economic justice, reshaping gender norms in ways that would linger long after Appomattox children, too, entered the labor force in greater numbers. Boys left school early to work in mills or on farms, while girls took in sewing or domestic work. Family economies became patchworks of sacrifice, with each member contributing what they could. The wages of children, meager though they were, often made the difference between hunger and survival. Diaries from the period record mothers weeping as they sent 10-year-olds into factories, comforted only by the thought that such labor supported both the household and the Union cause. In some communities, mutual aid societies filled the gap left by government pay. Neighbors pooled resources, ensuring that no soldier's family went entirely without. Churches organized subscription drives, while women's groups collected clothing and food. These acts of solidarity softened the blow of greenback erosion, but they also underscored the failure of official support. The very existence of such networks testified to the inadequacy of soldier wages. The government was not blind to these struggles. Officials debated raising pay, but the Treasury resisted, fearing that higher wages would worsen inflation. It was a cruel bind: increase pay, and risk devaluing the dollar further. Keep pay steady, and risk starving the very men who fought. In the end, compromise proved elusive, and soldiers continued to serve under conditions that felt increasingly unjust. Among the soldiers themselves, grumbling grew louder. Letters from the front lines reveal a sense of betrayal. "We march without boots, eat without meat, and are paid with paper that buys neither," wrote one Union private. Desertion, though punished harshly, sometimes stemmed less from cowardice than from despair over families left destitute to fight for the Union. While watching one's children suffer was a contradiction that many found unbearable. The inequity of pay also bred tension within the ranks. Officers earned significantly more than enlisted men, and their wages stretched further in practice. Privates whispered resentfully about captains dining on better food or affording luxuries while their own families scraped by. Though camaraderie remained strong, class divisions within the army mirrored those of society at large. Money, or the lack of it, seeped even into the bonds of military brotherhood. One of the most poignant aspects of this wage crisis was how soldiers framed their sacrifices in moral terms. Many did not expect wealth, but they expected fairness. When greenbacks failed to feed families, soldiers interpreted it not simply as economic hardship, but as moral neglect by their government. Trust in the Union cause could withstand enemy bullets, but it struggled under the weight of broken promises. Despite all this, soldiers continued to serve, their loyalty stretched thin, but rarely broken. Patriotism, duty, and the bonds of comradeship held them in the ranks, even as their wages shrank. It is a testament to human endurance that so many endured years of hardship for so little material reward. The greenback may have lost its purchasing power, but it never lost its symbolic one. Soldiers clung to it as proof that they had not been entirely forgotten, that their sacrifices had at least some recognition. As the war entered its final year, the debate over wages had become part of the broader story of the Union's survival. The greenback was no longer just a piece of paper, was a barometer of faith in government, a test of loyalty, and a source of bitter contention. In kitchens, churches, and camps. Americans asked the same question: could a nation truly honor its soldiers if it could not even pay them fairly? By the winter of 1864 to 65, the cracks in the system of greenback wages were undeniable. Across the Union, newspapers were filled with reports of hunger, debt, and quiet despair. Families of soldiers wrote desperate appeals, not to their loved ones who could do nothing but to governors, congressmen, and relief committees. Some of these letters survive, stained with tears and blotches of ink. Sir, I have 3 children, and no coal for the stove. My husband sends his pay, but it will not buy food enough. Must my babies freeze while he bleeds for the country? The words struck at the conscience of a weary nation. At the same time, charity efforts multiplied. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, though best known for providing medical aid to soldiers, also directed resources toward soldiers' families. Aid societies held fairs in major cities, where patriotic women sold quilts, pies, and even curiosities to raise funds. In New York, a fair in 1864 brought in over $1 million, enormous sum at the time, which was distributed to needy households. Yet even this generosity was only a patch on a widening hole. Inflation ate away at every dollar raised almost as quickly as it arrived. Within the camps, soldiers followed these stories with growing unease. When letters arrived describing hardships at home, morale sagged. Commanders noted that men fought bravely in battle, yet sat silently by the fire at night, their thoughts heavy with worry for wives and children. A sergeant in the Army of the Potomac confessed in his diary, "I fear not death, but I fear for Mary and the children. What will become of them if my pay cannot clothe or feed them?" Such sentiments reveal how deeply the crisis of wages affected not just families, but the fighting spirit of the Army itself. The irony of the situation was cruel. Wall Street speculators grew rich by wagering on the very greenbacks that soldiers struggled to stretch. Merchants in cities passed rising costs on to families, while the rural poor had no buffer at all. The uneven distribution of suffering sharpened class resentment. A shoemaker's wife in Connecticut wrote bitterly, "The rich clap their hands at victories, while we go without bread. Is this the freedom our husbands die for?" Her words echoed across communities, blending patriotism with disillusionment, yet resilience remained. Women, often portrayed only as passive sufferers, proved remarkably resourceful. They organized neighborhood barter networks, trading butter for cloth, firewood for shoes. They planted gardens, raised chickens, and taught children to mend rather than replace. Survival became an act of quiet defiance against both inflation and indifference. In these efforts, the greenback remained central not as a stable medium of exchange, but as the reminder of promises that had to be supplemented by ingenuity. For African American families, the struggle carried additional layers of meaning. Wives of black soldiers not only faced poverty, but also the ever-present threat of racial violence and discrimination in northern communities. Some landlords refused to rent to them, and merchants sometimes charged higher prices. That they endured these burdens while their husbands fought for a union that only belatedly recognized their equal pay is a testament to extraordinary resilience. The greenbacks they received were more than wages. They were tangible proof of freedom hard won, even if the money itself barely sufficed. By early 1865, debates in Congress intensified. Should soldier wages be raised? Could the Treasury sustain it? Opponents warned of further inflation, while supporters argued that justice demanded action. In the end, adjustments were meager, and too late for many. The war's final months passed with families still struggling, making do with less, clinging to faith that peace would bring relief. As Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, soldiers cheered, but their letters home revealed another emotion: longing for economic stability. Now perhaps our money will be worth what it claims, one private wrote. His hope was shared by thousands who had endured years of scraping by, stretching every note, waiting for the day when the Union's promise would be restored, not only in politics but in their purses. The story of soldier wages is not just one of insufficiency, but of endurance. Families bore the weight of greenback erosion with creativity, solidarity, and courage. They stretched paper promises into survival, transforming fragile notes into threads that bound the home front to the battlefield. Their struggles remind us that wars are not fought by soldiers alone, but by entire households, each carrying burdens, invisible yet vital to the nation's survival. When the war finally ended in the spring of 1865, relief swept across the Union like a cleansing wind. Soldiers returned home, greeted with parades, embraces, and tears. Yet for many, the joy of reunion was shadowed by years of financial strain. Families had endured hunger, debt, and constant anxiety, their survival balanced on fragile strips of green paper. The war was over, but the scars of inadequate wages remained etched into daily life. One of the most striking realities of peace was how quickly soldiers confronted the gap between expectation and reality. They had fought for years, often imagining that victory would bring prosperity, or at least stability. Instead, they found debts waiting at home, unpaid rents, mortgages in arrears, pawned belongings. Some soldiers sold their uniforms for cash before even reaching their hometowns, a symbol of how quickly service gave way to necessity. Greenbacks, once symbols of sacrifice and loyalty, became reminders of hardship. Many families tucked them away as keepsakes, folding a worn dollar bill into the family Bible, or keeping it in a box of wartime relics. Not because it had economic worth, but because it had emotional weight. The notes were stained with the story of survival, the thread that tied absent fathers to struggling households. A faded greenback might buy little, but it carried the memory of sacrificed communities to remembered. In small towns, monuments were erected to honor soldiers. Yet behind the marble and speeches lay another truth. Women and children had fought their own war at home. Their tools were not rifles and cannons, but sewing needles, cooking pots, and endless calculations of how far a dollar could stretch. These invisible battles were rarely acknowledged in parades, but they were no less essential. To Union victory, African American veterans faced an even harsher reality. Having won their freedom through service and endured years of unequal pay, they returned to communities that often denied them equal opportunity. Their families bore scars of both poverty and prejudice. Yet their greenbacks, however meager, carried profound symbolic meaning. For many, it was the first time wages had been earned for labor freely given, rather than stolen by bondage. That fact, even more than the money itself, testified to a revolution in their lives. In the political sphere, debates continued long after Appomattox. Should veterans receive bonuses? Should pensions be increased to reflect the hardships families had endured? Slowly, over decades, the government expanded pensions and support, but for many families, these came too late. Widows who had pawned wedding rings to survive during the war rarely recovered them. Children who had gone hungry remembered those lean years for the rest of their lives. And yet, there was pride. In memoirs and oral histories, families spoke of their sacrifices, not only with bitterness, but also with honor. They had kept the home fires burning, endured hunger so that the Union might live. Greenbacks may have failed to provide, but they had not failed to connect. They were the fragile lifeline between battlefields and kitchens, a symbol of shared struggle in a nation fighting for its very existence. The broader lesson was clear. Wars are not financed in Washington alone, nor fought only on the front lines. They are carried in the purses of widows, in the hands of children sent to work, in the weary calculations of mothers who stretched paper promises into survival. The Civil War demonstrated that economic burdens fell as heavily on the home front as on the battlefield, and that currency, no matter how unstable, could shape the course of human lives as powerfully as muskets and cannons. As the United States transitioned from war to peace, the story of greenback wages remained a quiet but enduring chapter. The nation learned that money is never just money. It is trust, sacrifice, and memory. For the families of Union soldiers, each faded note was a testament not only to hardship, but to endurance. They had survived the war in their own way, with resilience that rivaled the heroism of soldiers, and in that survival lay the true value of the greenback, not its purchasing power, but its role as a thread binding families to the nation's struggle, weaving together sacrifice at home with victory in the field. When the guns finally fell silent in 1865, the Union had been preserved, slavery had been abolished, and nearly 750,000 Americans lay dead. Yet beyond the battlefield, another legacy endured. The greenback, born of necessity, scorned as unstable, and cherished as a lifeline, these pieces of paper survived the war as much more than emergency currency. They had become symbols of both the nation's fragility and its resilience. The question facing Americans in peacetime was simple: what to do with them now? For many, the first instinct was to return to the old order: hard money, gold, and silver. Bankers and conservative politicians insisted that paper could never be trusted, that true stability lay in the solidity of coin. To them, greenbacks were temporary scaffolding, useful in crisis, but dangerous in normalcy. Senator John Sherman of Ohio warned that without a return to sound money, the nation risked financial ruin. Editorials echoed the call. Gold was real, while paper was only a shadow. But the war had changed more than armies and maps. It had transformed the very way Americans thought about money. Ordinary citizens who had once handled little beyond coins now used paper daily. They paid rent, bought goods, and saved notes in jars or drawers. For millions, greenbacks had become money, full stop. The notion that value rested solely in shiny metal discs began to feel antiquated. Like soldiers adjusting to life after war, the nation had to reckon with a new reality: that trust, not gold, was the true backbone of currency. The inflationary scars, however, were real. Families remembered with bitterness the days when a loaf of bread doubled in price overnight, or when wages shrank before their eyes. For them, the greenback carried not only utility, but also trauma. The memory of hunger and want made many wary of leaving the paper system unregulated. If greenbacks were to remain, they must be tied to discipline, rules, and perhaps eventually redemption in coin. This tension between the convenience of paper and the security of metal defined the financial debates of the post-war years. Farmers in the Midwest, struggling with debts, favored keeping greenbacks in circulation, as more paper meant easier credit. Bankers in New York, by contrast, demanded contraction, fearing inflation would erode savings and investments. The debate was not abstract. It was visceral, pitting regions and classes against one another. In this way, the legacy of wartime money extended far beyond economics. It shaped politics. The so-called greenback question became a defining issue of Reconstruction, influencing elections and fueling new political movements. Newspapers carried endless arguments about whether the government should retire the notes, redeem them for gold, or maintain them permanently. Citizens debated the matter in taverns, churches, and town halls, with the same passion once reserved for battles. Perhaps most remarkable was how quickly Americans began to see money not merely as an economic tool, but as a political weapon. Farmers argued that contraction was a plot by elites to keep them in debt. Bankers insisted that inflation was theft from savers. Laborers asked why their wages should lose value, while speculators thrived. Every faction claimed the mantle of fairness, and every faction pointed to the Civil War. Experience as evidence for its case. The very existence of this debate signaled a profound shift. Before the war, most Americans accepted money as a given, its form dictated by banks or government with little input from ordinary people. After the war, money became a subject of national argument, open to democratic contests. The greenback had democratized not only currency, but also the conversation about currency. And so, as America rebuilt from the ruins of war, the greenback remained at the center of its struggles. It was a reminder of what had been endured and a test of what the future might hold. Would the nation retreat to gold or embrace paper? Would money be the domain of elites or the property of the people? These were no longer technical questions for bankers. They were questions of democracy itself. In the years immediately following the Civil War, greenbacks became lightning rods for political conflict. To some, they symbolized national strength, the proof that a republic could finance itself in a time of crisis without collapsing. To others, they were dangerous reminders of inflation and uncertainty, a kind of paper Pandora's box that should be shut as quickly as possible. The debate took on a personal edge. Farmers across the Midwest and Great Plains, burdened with debts, often favored keeping greenbacks in circulation. Cheap money, they argued, meant higher crop prices and easier repayment of loans. A farmer in Illinois wrote to his congressman, "In 1867, if greenbacks are called in, I will be ruined. My corn may grow, but my debts will choke me." For these families, paper money was not an abstraction, but a lifeline. Bankers, creditors, and wealthy merchants saw things differently. They wanted the government to reduce the supply of greenbacks, contract the currency, and return to a system where dollars were as good as gold. Only then, they argued, could stability and investor confidence be restored. A Boston banker declared, "Without contraction, there can be no trust. Without trust, there can be no prosperity." In his view, every greenback still circulating was a crack in the nation's financial foundation. This conflict spilled into Congress. Should greenbacks be retired, slowly pulled from circulation until gold and silver once again defined value? Or should they be accepted as permanent fixtures of the economy? The debates were fierce, filled with both economic theories and fiery rhetoric. Advocates of contraction spoke of discipline, morality, and the dangers of paper illusions. Advocates of expansion invoked democracy, opportunity, and the needs of the common man. The debate grew so heated that it spawned a political movement, the Greenback Party. Emerging in the 1870s, it rallied farmers, laborers, and those who felt left behind by Eastern elites. Their platform was simple but radical. Keep greenbacks, issue more of them, and put the power of money in the hands of the people rather than bankers. They argued that money should serve democracy, not just wealth. Though the party never won national power, it influenced elections and pushed mainstream politicians to take the issue seriously. What made the greenback question so volatile was that it cut across traditional political lines. Republicans and Democrats alike found themselves divided internally, some favoring contraction, others expansion. Old party loyalties were scrambled as farmers looked for champions and creditors looked for security. In taverns and newspapers, arguments over the future of money often overshadowed debates about Reconstruction itself. At the heart of these struggles lay a deeper question. What is money? Is it a physical thing, bound to the weight of gold? Or is it an agreement, a matter of trust between people and their government? The Civil War had cracked open that philosophical debate, and Americans could no longer pretend it was merely technical. A farmer in Kansas put it plainly, "If the people agree that paper is money, then paper is money. Why should we bow to the gold men of New York?" The irony was striking. A nation that had fought a bloody war to preserve the Union now risked fracturing again, this time not over slavery or secession, but over the meaning of a dollar. The battles were fought not with muskets, but with speeches, petitions, and votes. Yet the passions ran nearly as high, for the stakes were immense, the livelihoods of millions, and the future shape of the American economy. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens adjusted in their own ways. Some hoarded gold coins when they could, tucking them away in secret drawers as insurance against paper's collapse. Others embraced greenbacks fully, treating them no differently from coin and dismissing gold bugs as elitists clinging to the past. In markets, shops, and farms, the argument played out daily with every transaction, every bargain, every choice to save or spend. In this way, the legacy of the Civil War currency crisis extended far beyond finance. It shaped how Americans saw themselves as citizens, active participants in defining value, not passive recipients of rules handed down from above. The greenback debate was, in its own way, a continuation of the Democratic Revolution, carried out not with muskets or ballots alone, but with banknotes and ledgers. By the 1870s, the Civil War was more than a memory. It was a living shadow shaping America's political and economic choices. The greenback stood at the center of that shadow, a reminder of both survival and sacrifice. While parades honored veterans and monuments rose in town squares, ordinary families still lived with the consequences of wartime paper money. Every debate about the dollar's future carried the echo of cannon fire and the scent of campfire smoke. The push to retire greenbacks and restore gold convertibility gained momentum in the decade after Appomattox. Policymakers argued that national credibility depended on it. Foreign investors, especially in Britain, watched America's currency anxiously, wary of lending to a nation still awash in paper promises. Restoring gold redemption, they said, would prove that the Union's financial house was in order. In 1875, Congress passed the Resumption Act, scheduling a return to gold payments in 1879. The law was celebrated by bankers as a triumph of discipline. But for farmers and laborers, the Resumption Act felt like betrayal. Prices for crops and wages were already falling, squeezed by deflation. Contraction of the money supply, they feared, would drive them into deeper debt and poverty. A Kansas farmer bitterly observed, "The war took my son, and now it takes my farm. They call it resumption. I call it robbery." His words reflected the view of thousands who believed that contraction favored creditors at the expense of workers. These grievances fueled not only the Greenback Party, but also broader populist movements. At rallies across the Midwest, fiery speakers denounced the money power of Wall Street and demanded that the government issue currency directly for the benefit of the people. Some even drew parallels between financial elites and the old slaveholding class, accusing both of enslaving ordinary Americans, one with chains, the other with debt. The rhetoric was dramatic, but it revealed how deeply the politics of money had penetrated the popular imagination in cities. Working men's organizations joined the cause. They argued that wages could not sustain families if the dollar grew scarcer and prices fell. Labor newspapers carried cartoons showing workers crushed beneath the weight of hard money, while speculators lounged on piles of gold. The greenback thus became more than a financial tool-it became a symbol in a broader struggle over class, democracy, and fairness. Yet despite the protests, the Resumption Act moved forward. When 1879 arrived, the Treasury stood ready to redeem greenbacks for gold. To the surprise of many, the public response was muted. People did not rush to exchange notes for coins. Instead, confidence in the greenback actually grew, for the very promise of redemption gave them credibility. Ironically, by preparing to replace greenbacks, the government had strengthened them. This paradox was not lost on observers. Economists pointed out that the Civil War had permanently altered the meaning of money in America. Trust in the government itself, rather than in metal, had become the ultimate foundation. As long as people believed the Treasury could back its notes, the paper was as good as gold, even if most people preferred the lighter, easier to use paper over heavy coins. The legacy of this shift rippled forward. Future debates over silver, gold, and paper would continue to divide the nation, culminating in the Cross of Gold speech of 1896. But the root of that conflict lay in the war's greenbacks, in the painful experiment that had taught Americans to question what money was and who controlled it. Beyond economics, the memory of greenback wages remained powerful in households across the Union. Veterans told their children of the meager pay that shrank with each month of service, while widows recalled scraping by with depreciating notes. These stories were passed down not as abstract lessons in finance, but as lived experiences of sacrifice. The greenback became part of family lore, stitched into the fabric of Civil War memory, alongside Gettysburg and Appomattox. Thus, by the end of the 1870s, the greenback had secured its place in American history, not only as a temporary wartime expedient, but as a permanent feature of political imagination. It embodied both hardship and resilience, both betrayal and promise. And even as the nation returned officially to gold, the lesson of paper money remained. Trust could be as powerful as metal, and democracy itself could shape the meaning of value. By the 1880s, the greenback had outlived its original wartime purpose. Yet it refused to fade quietly into history. It remained in circulation, a daily reminder of the nation's great experiment in fiat money. For many Americans, especially in rural communities, the greenback was simply money, trusted and used without hesitation. But in political circles, it remained a touchstone for arguments about power, fairness, and the future of the economy. The Greenback Party, though never dominant, reached its peak in this decade. At rallies, speakers invoked the struggles of soldiers' families during the war, insisting that paper currency had been the people's salvation. It was not gold that fed our armies, one orator thundered in Indiana, but the greenback. It was not bankers who saved the Union, but farmers and workers, paid in paper, who bore the cost. The crowd erupted, not because they loved lectures on economics, but because they recognized their own hardships in his words. The party's demands went beyond merely keeping greenbacks. They called for more government-issued paper money to fuel economic growth, pay off debts, and empower ordinary citizens. To them, money was not a natural element to be mined from the ground, but a social contract, created and controlled by the people through their government. This view clashed directly with the hard money orthodoxy of bankers and conservatives, who insisted that only gold could anchor trust. Though the Greenback Party eventually declined, absorbed into the broader populist movement, it left a lasting imprint. The idea that money could and should be democratized, shaped to serve the needs of workers and farmers, remained a powerful undercurrent in American politics. When William Jennings Bryan later declared, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," he was echoing decades of frustration first kindled in the Civil War. Meanwhile, on the ground, Americans adjusted pragmatically. Merchants, shopkeepers, and farmers continued to use greenbacks, blending them seamlessly with coins in daily trade. For many, the philosophical battles in Washington felt distant. What mattered was whether a note bought flour, shoes, or a railroad ticket. And by the 1880s, greenbacks largely did. The promise of gold redemption had stabilized them, even if most people never bothered to exchange their notes for metal. Still, cultural memory of the inflation years lingered. Grandparents told stories of when a soldier's pay bought less each month, or when prices rose so fast, a week's wages vanished in days. These tales became part of the oral tradition of the war, shaping how future generations understood both sacrifice and resilience. In family lore, the greenback was not just money. It was a symbol of endurance, of making do with little, of surviving against odds. The legacy also extended into intellectual life. Economists debated the lessons of the greenback era with fervor. Some praised it as proof that fiat money could work if managed responsibly. Others condemned it as a dangerous experiment, warning against ever repeating it. University lectures, scholarly journals, and political pamphlets dissected the experience with the same intensity as military historians writing about Gettysburg. The Civil War, it turned out, had produced not only generals and martyrs, but also economic philosophers. Internationally, the American experiment with greenbacks caught attention. European observers, especially in Britain, regarded it with skepticism, calling it reckless. Yet some reformers on the continent admired it, suggesting that perhaps governments need not be shackled to gold. In this way, America's paper money became part of a global debate about the future of finance, foreshadowing struggles that would recur in the 20th century during wars, depressions, and crises. For ordinary Americans, however, the true legacy was simpler. The greenback had carried them through fire. It may have been flawed, unstable, even humiliating at times, but it represented survival, and survival had a dignity of its own. Whether tucked into a Bible, pressed into a scrapbook, or handed across a store counter, the greenback remained woven into the everyday life of the nation long after the last shots of the Civil War faded, as the 19th century drew to a close. The greenback's journey from desperate wartime expedient to permanent part of the nation's money supply was complete. No longer dismissed as shin plasters or rags, the notes had gained acceptance, not because they were flawless, but because Americans had lived with them, adapted to them, and found ways to make them work. The Civil War had tested the Union's survival on the battlefield. The greenback had tested its survival in the marketplace in 1900. The passage of the Gold Standard Act officially committed the United States to backing currency with gold. On the surface, this seemed like the triumph of the hard money men, a final victory over the paper experiments of the Civil War. But even in triumph, the legacy of the greenback lingered. The very fact that Americans continued to use paper, notes trusted them, saved them, and spent them meant that the principle had already taken root. Money was not just metal, but faith. Indeed, the deeper lesson of the greenback was about trust in institutions. Americans had seen firsthand that paper money could fuel armies, feed families, and sustain a nation, so long as people believed in it. The war had shown that confidence, not gold alone, was the bedrock of value. That insight would prove essential in the 20th century, when the U.S. and other nations would once again suspend gold payments during world wars and, eventually, abandon the standard altogether. In a sense, the modern dollar floating fiat, trusted worldwide, was the distant heir of Lincoln's greenbacks. Yet the human side of the story should not be forgotten. For veterans and their families, the greenback remained a symbol of sacrifice. Diaries, letters, and memoirs recorded both frustration at its weakness and gratitude for its presence. Widows remembered pawning belongings to survive, while farmers recalled selling crops at inflated prices just to stay afloat. These stories were not just about economics, they were about resilience, dignity, and the cost of national survival. The politics of the greenback also left an indelible mark. The Greenback Party faded, but its ideas lived on in the populists, the progressives, and even in later debates over the Federal Reserve. The question of who controls money banks, government, or the people remained alive, shaping policy long after the war. Every later discussion of inflation, stimulus, or public debt carried, in some small way, the echo of the Civil War's paper revolution. In cultural memory, the greenback became almost mythic. Schoolbooks told children of how America had financed its greatest war with printed notes. Historians debated whether inflation was a necessary evil or a grievous mistake. Meanwhile, ordinary families kept faded bills in boxes, souvenirs of a time when survival itself had been measured in ink and paper. Perhaps the greatest irony was that the insult once hurled at the currency, not worth a Continental, no longer applied. The greenback, born under duress, had done what the Continental dollar of the Revolution could not. It had endured, fragile, mocked, and mistrusted at first. It had nevertheless carried the Union through its greatest trial, and in surviving, it had reshaped how Americans thought about value, democracy, and the role of government in their lives. Looking back from the vantage of the 20th century, the Civil War's paper money experiment appears less like a temporary patch and more like a turning point. It marked the moment when America stepped into the modern financial age, where trust mattered as much as metal, and where the choices of farmers, workers, and ordinary citizens could shape the destiny of the dollar as surely as bankers or politicians. The greenback was never perfect. It inflated, it frustrated, it sparked endless quarrels. But it also united a nation in crisis, feeding armies, sustaining homes, and proving that the faith of the people could hold up an economy as surely as steel. Rails held up a train. That was its true legacy, not merely financial, but democratic. And so, as the last veterans of the Civil War faded into history, the paper they had carried home in their pockets lived on in every dollar bill that passed from hand to hand. Each note whispered of sacrifice, resilience, and the strange alchemy of trust that turns ink and paper into the lifeblood of a nation. And so, dear listener, we reach the end of our long, meandering journey through the strange world of Civil War money. It began with desperation, Lincoln's government staring down empty coffers and turning to paper notes that barely deserved to be called money. It moved through years of inflation, sacrifice, and survival, where a soldier's wages shrank like wool in hot water, and families stretched every dollar until it was thin as parchment. It carried us into the chaos of Reconstruction, where farmers, bankers, and politicians wrestled over the meaning of value itself. And it ended with a legacy that reached far beyond the 19th century, shaping the very dollars in your wallet today. The greenback story is not just a tale of economics, it's a tale of people. Of widows pawning their wedding rings, of farmers cursing falling prices, of soldiers sending home crumpled notes that were worth less with every passing month. It's also a tale of ambition politicians fighting not only over policy, but over philosophy. What is money? Is it shiny metal, dug from the earth and guarded in vaults? Or is it trust, scribbled in ink and carried in faith? The Civil War cracked that debate wide open, and we are still living with its consequences. Think about it. Every time you tap a plastic card or send a digital payment, you're engaging in the same leap of faith that Americans wrestled with in the 1860s. There is no gold coin in a vault somewhere waiting for you. There is only trust that your bank, your government, and your society will honor the promise. And that is the true legacy of the greenback. The realization that money lives in our collective belief, not in glittering metal. There is, of course, a certain comedy in it all. Imagine a farmer in 1864, selling his corn for a stack of paper that looked suspiciously like a bad stage prop, while a banker in Boston lectured him about sound money and moral discipline. Fast forward a century and a half, and we swipe rectangles of plastic or scan QR codes at coffee shops without blinking. The Civil War generation would be either horrified or impressed, perhaps both. History, as always, loves its ironies. The greenbacks were derided as flimsy, mocked as rag money, feared as ruinous. And yet, they outlasted their critics, embedding themselves in the very fabric of American life. By the time the Gold Standard Act was passed in 1900, paper was already the daily norm. The bankers won the argument on paper, but the people had already won it in practice. And what about us? We live in a world where central banks conjure trillions with a keystroke, where inflation debates still dominate headlines, and where politicians still argue about who money should serve. The echoes of the greenback era ring louder than ever. Should money be tightened to protect the value of savings, or loosened to fuel growth and help ordinary workers? Lincoln's greenback gamble made sure that these questions would never go away. So perhaps the best way to remember the greenback is not as a dusty artifact in a museum case, but as a mirror. It reflects back to us the eternal truth that money is not just about coins and bills, it's about people, power, and trust. Wars, crises, and politics may change the forms it takes, but the essence remains the same. The Civil War showed us that even in the darkest hours, faith in paper and in each other could carry a nation forward. And with that, our story closes. If you've drifted off into peaceful slumber, somewhere between Appomattox and the Gold Standard Act, I take that as the highest compliment. But if you're still awake, first, congratulations. Second, consider this. History is never really over. It lingers in our pockets, in our debates, even in the quiet trust we place in a dollar bill. If you enjoyed this journey, if you learned something new, chuckled at the ironies, or simply found comfort in the gentle march of history, I'd love for you to join me again. Tap that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, or subscribe for more long meandering tales that are equal parts enlightening and sleep-inducing. After all, there's always another story, waiting another strange corner of history, where people did their best with what they had, and left us lessons wrapped in time. Until then, may your dreams be calm, your debts be light, and may your trust in paper or pixels never waver. Good night.